Good morning, everyone. Nurses in England are striking for a second day today, along with paramedics in Wales, as the wave of industrial action in the NHS just keeps on growing. Hospital leaders are preparing for bigger coordinated walkouts next month, set to be the largest strike in the history of the health service after ambulance workers voted to join nurses in a combined day of action on the 6th of February. Emergency 999 call workers also going on strike that day. Shaman standing by for us this morning. Hello to you, Shaman. Goodness me, 6th of February, not a day to be poorly, is it?
No, it won't be. As you say, it will be a huge day for industrial action. Today, we are expecting more nurses on the picket line in central London. It comes as thousands of nurses across the country and around 55 different NHS trusts will be taking strike action today. And as you say, on the 6th of February, that's when the third round of strike action from nurses represented by the Royal College of Nursing Union will also be taking their strike action on the same day as the GMB union. Now that's a union that has around 10,000 members, and it also represents ambulance workers, paramedics, emergency care assistants and call handlers. They've announced that they'll be striking on the 6th of February along with nurses, as well as on the 20th of February, March the 6th and the 20th of March. Now yesterday we heard from nurses about some of the reasons why they have decided to join the picket lines. They were speaking about pay, about how their pay hasn't risen in line with inflation and how them and their colleagues are having to rely on things like food banks to be able to get through the month. On top of that, they're speaking about staff shortages, which is making the day job hard, and it's also having a direct impact on patients. So these are some of the same issues that ambulance workers are also complaining about, and this is causing a huge concern for NHS managers. We've heard from Saffron Cordery, who's the chief exec for NHS Providers Organisation, who said they're really worried about this coordinated strike action planned for February. She said that nobody in the NHS wants more strikes, including those on the picket line, urging ministers to get around the table with unions to urgently deal with the key issue of pay for this financial month. And of course, the government have spoken about negotiating with pay, but have refused so far to discuss this current financial year. And this is something that especially the nurses unions won't bend on. They're saying that this current financial year needs to be addressed. Now, there is room for negotiation. The government said that they are open to talking with unions, but they say that so far the requests that are being made by unions are unrealistic, and therefore they need to get round the table to open up those discussions again. And until then, there will be further strike action throughout the course of today and tomorrow and in coming weeks.
OK, Michael, thanks very much indeed. Michael Gove for the government today, joining us live from Blackpool. We'll tell you why in just a second. First, though, Mr Gove, good morning to you. Let's talk about the strikes, should we? Former Levelling Up Secretary Simon Clarke, your predecessor, criticised nurses for not budgeting their finances properly if they need to use feed banks. Gillian Keegan saying nurses only turn to food banks when a relationship or a boiler has broken down. Do you agree with your cabinet colleagues that nurses are excellent at saving lives but hopeless with their finances?
No, I would never put it that way. I think we appreciate that nurses, everyone who's working on the front line in the National Health Service, is not only doing an amazing job, and my thanks and gratitude to nurses today is something I want to express very deeply and personally. I also think that when we're looking at the pay claims that are being made by people within the National Health Service and also people in other parts of the public sector, we have to balance making sure that we do everything we can to reward them for their hard work with recognising that we also have to be careful stewards of public money overall. And what we can't do is necessarily accede to every demand in the public sector for pay increases, because we don't want to be in a position where the public finances overall are out of control.
Yeah, so your colleagues are wrong to criticise the way nurses manage their money?
I would never criticise nurses for something like that. I think the most important thing to do is to recognise that people who are working in the NHS are people who've dedicated their lives to a caring profession. They're doing everything they can to support us. I know myself in recent weeks, having seen the NHS close, upfront and personal, the dedicated care that nurses and others who work in the National Health Service give. And of course, we want to do everything possible in order to make sure that people are paid well and in accordance with their skills and respecting their commitment. But we also have to balance that against the need, as I say, to make sure that that public funds are spent wisely.
I hope that you're fully recovered
Yes.
from having to use the National Health Service previously and that your health has recovered. Thank you for sharing that with us. What about this coordinated strike action with nurses, ambulance workers and emergency call handlers on the 6th of February? How responsible is it of those workers to all strike on the same day?
Well, naturally, we would prefer there not to be any strikes at all, and we prefer there not to be coordinated strike action of this kind. I'd just say two things. The first is that I'm conscious that ambulance workers, nurses and others, when they do go on strike action, and I don't approve of it, I have to say, but they do take steps in order to ensure that they can look after the most urgent emergency cases. The second thing that I would say is that we are introducing legislation to make sure that there is a minimum service level that should provide people with peace of mind, that there will always be an NHS there for them, and indeed other blue light services that they need. It's just unfortunate that other parties in the House of Commons, Labour and the Liberal Democrats, won't support that legislation in order to make sure that there will be a minimum level of service for everyone.
You're in Blackpool today, £40 million for a new carbon-neutral multiversity in Blackpool, and people can't afford to put their heating on in Blackpool. Are you going at it the wrong way?
No, this is, I think, the fourth time I've been in Blackpool this year, and the reason I'm here is that we want to level up the whole country. We want to make sure that in areas like Blackpool, that have been overlooked and undervalued in the past, there's an investment in the future. So earlier this year, we invested £30 million in helping to regenerate the very heart of Blackpool, to bring new jobs and investment here. And today, we're announcing £40 million for a new higher education campus here, a multiversity, which will ensure that young people in Blackpool get the sorts of opportunities that young people in the rest of the country have had. If we're going to make sure that people get the sort of high-earning jobs, which will guarantee their and their families' future, we need to invest now in education, and nowhere is more important than here in the North West.
Yeah, you say that, but while running for Prime Minister in the summer, a video emerged of the now Prime Minister admitting he took money from deprived areas to give it to other parts of the country. Rather flies in the face of what you've just said.
Well, the proof actually is what the Prime Minister is doing and what we're doing today. That's more than £2 billion being spent on more than 100 projects across the United Kingdom. And the areas that are benefiting, places like Blackpool and Morecambe and Cleethorpes and Wigan, these are areas which have been overlooked in the past by previous governments. But this government is absolutely committed to levelling up, to spreading opportunity and to investing in the future and making sure that people have, whether it's investment in higher education here or investment in economic activity elsewhere, the opportunity to prosper in the future.
Yeah, you were remiss not to mention Richmond in that list as well, I would suggest. Of course, the constituency of the Prime Minister, they're receiving £19 million as part of this handing out of cash, our cash. It's been described as the posh part of Yorkshire, the Surrey of the North, and income deprivation down to 22% as opposed to Blackpool, where it's 61%.
Well, we are giving money to Catterick, but that money is going to the biggest army infantry base in the country. Again, over recent weeks, I've had an opportunity to talk to service families about their accommodation. I don't think anyone would deny that investing money in making sure that our service families have absolutely the best circumstances to support them, I don't think anyone would deny that is a good use of money. And if people want to say that service families and that the Catterick garrison doesn't deserve cash, then let them.
OK, I'm sure they will. Let me ask you about Wigan. You talked about Wigan, which of course is where your opposite number resides, representing the good people of Wigan. The leader of the council, 20 million quid or thereabouts for Hay Hall, where I got married actually. The council say, although we are relieved to have received confirmation of the funding for Hay Hall, our concerns about the levelling up fund system remain, and we would continue to urge the government to find a more appropriate way to deliver the investment local areas like ours deserve.
Well, again, you can't always necessarily expect gratitude in politics, but I do think it is a good thing that we're contributing millions of pounds to Wigan. The investment in Hayhall is an investment that the council itself argued for. And again, the inference was from the previous question that some, not UK, but some, would be criticising the money that's going to Catterick to help army families. This is money that is going to the constituency, as you quite rightly point out, of my opposite number Labour MP Lisa Nandy. So we have objective criteria that govern where money is going. We look at the strategic fit, the deliverability, the economic benefits, and heritage matters as well. So that investment in Hayhall is an investment in Wigan's future.
OK, but the announcement leaves out a lot of the more deprived areas in the UK, disproportionately benefiting Conservative areas, I'm told. Of the 80 successful bids, only half are in the 100 most deprived areas of the country.
Well, there are areas of deprivation across the whole United Kingdom. I think it is the case, actually, that more Labour local authorities than Conservative local authorities receive money. But it will be news to people in Cleethorpes or in Workington who are receiving money today that they're not areas of high need, areas that have been undervalued in the past.
Good to talk to you as always. Thanks for taking the time to join us in God's own country this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. Thank you. Thank you, Kate.
For you. Bye. Still to come on the programme for you this morning, just after 8, joined, as you heard, by the Shadow Levelling Up Secretary, Lisa Nandy. With thousands of nurses striking today, speaking to the Royal College of Nursing's General Secretary, Pat Cullen. And as we enter deadline day for the restoration of power sharing at Stormont, joined in the studio by Sinn Féin leader, Mary Lou McDonald. Before that, though, let's talk about New Zealand's Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern. She has unexpectedly quit, saying she will step down next month and will not contest this year's general election. Fighting back tears, she said she no longer has enough in the tank to do the job justice.
I'm not leaving because it was hard. Had that been the case, I probably would have departed 2 months into the job. I am leaving because with such a privileged role comes responsibility. The responsibility to know when you are the right person to lead and also when you are not. I know what this job takes, and I know that I no longer have enough in the tank to do it justice. It's that simple.
Well, Nicole's standing by for us in Sydney with more this morning. Wow, that was a surprise, wasn't it? Good morning.
It was a surprise, and speaking to New Zealanders, they all say that they're shocked by the news. They had been expecting that she would stay around for the next election, but clearly, as we heard from an emotional Jacinda Ardern, she's exhausted. She's been running the country for 5, coming into 6 years, and during that long press conference, she said time and time again, there's not enough left in the tank, and I'm only human. She also said that she wants to marry her partner and she'd like to be there for her daughter. But time after time, there's been loads of crises in New Zealand, not only the global pandemic, but also in 2019, we had the Christchurch massacre, 51 people killed in New Zealand, gunned down in 2 mosques in that city. And that actually elevated the status of Jacinda Ardern on the international stage. She was seen as a caring, compassionate leader, empathetic. I was there during that period. She comforted New Zealanders. She wore the headscarf. And all of these images were broadcast around the world and really contributed to a lot of the sort of myth-making around Jacinda Ardern, this young female politician in a small country of only 5 million people. But over the last few months, her popularity domestically has been waning, as has the popularity of her party, the Labour Party. New Zealand is suffering the same problems that the rest of the world has, an economic crisis, rising inflation, soaring house prices, and a population that's just sick of it, really. So there was a lot of concern about how she would lead the party coming up to this election. But for New Zealanders, they're still very proud of the role that Jacinda Ardern played on the international stage, and she enabled that country to punch above its weight diplomatically.
OK. For now, thank you. Thanks a lot, Nicole. Let's talk about King Charles, who's asked for the profits from £1 billion a year Crown Estate wind farm deal to be used for the wider public good, rather than as funding for the monarchy. 6 new offshore wind energy lease agreements announced by the Crown Estate would usually bolster the monarchy's official funding, but the King has surrendered the revenue, more than £312 million a year, to the Treasury for the benefit of the nation's finances. Deadline day once again for the restoration of power sharing at Stormont. That means unless leaders are able to strike a deal by midnight, another election could be on the cards. Our senior island correspondent, David Blevins, is with us now at Stormont. This is Groundhog Day, isn't it?
Yes, Kay, wouldn't we be rich if we had £5 for every time they missed a deadline to form a power-sharing government here at Stormont? And they're going to do that again at midnight tonight. It means the Northern Ireland Secretary, Chris Heaton-Harris, has 12 weeks in which to make up his mind whether or not he's going to call another election, given that the campaign would take about 6 weeks. Realistically, he has to decide by the beginning of March. And most people think he's going to stall on that decision, awaiting the outcome of the ongoing negotiations between the EU and the UK on that tricky Northern Ireland protocol. They seem to be moving towards endgame there. They're working hard on finding technical solutions to the problems created by the establishment of a trade border in the Irish Sea between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But of course, it's always important to remember that this isn't just a technical problem. It's also a political problem. And the big question is, can they find a compromise that will be enough to persuade the Democratic Unionists to end their boycott of Stormont and come back into the power-sharing executive here before the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement in April? Will there be a government then? I wouldn't bet £5 on it.
We're chatting to Mary Lou McDonald a little bit later on. Obviously, Brexit very much going to come up.
Yes, Mary Lou McDonald, of course, is a woman who is riding high in the polls in the Republic of Ireland. Many people think she could well be the next Irish Prime Minister, the next Taoiseach. And of course, her deputy, Michelle O'Neill, is currently First Minister designate in Northern Ireland, the first nationalist to have been elected to that office. So if ever there was a moment when Sinn Féin might want to compromise with the Unionists in order to see the devolved government back up and running, it's right now. So it'll be interesting to hear what Mary Lou McDonald has to say about that, and also what she has to say about the new Irish Prime Minister, Taoiseach Leo Varadkar's approach to the negotiations with the EU on the Northern Ireland Protocol. Can the Irish government perhaps do something that persuades the EU to soften its line enough that will bring Unionists back into the power-sharing government here?
OK, David, I'll ask her. Thanks very much indeed for now. Thank you. Looking at some of today's other headlines for you now, and a hiker reported as missing in Southern California has been named as the British actor Julian Sands. He's 65, reported missing in the San Gabriel Mountains on Friday. He's known for his role in the film A Room with a View, of course, and the TV series Dexter. Authorities say the search for the actor will continue when weather conditions improve. Thousands of people from around Peru have travelled to the capital in support of the former president, Pedro Castillo, who was ousted and arrested last year after a failed attempt to avoid impeachment. 53 people have died in the unrest since the new president, Dino Boluarte, assumed office last month. Ferries from Dover to Calais are suspended today due to strike action in France. P&O Ferries have said services will not run from 7 a.m, but are expected to resume from 2 p.m. The 24-hour walkout is over the French government's plan to raise the retirement age. Police searching for a couple and a baby say they must have lots of cash on them as they've been living off-grid for 11 days. Officers have been trying to track down Constance Martin and Mark Gordon, who lost most of their belongings in a car fire after she gave birth. Elon Musk has been described as a liar in a securities fraud case. The Tesla owner was in court over a number of tweets he made about the company's status in 2018. The tweets indicated that Musk had secured the money to take Tesla private, which boosted its stock. But shareholders sued Musk after learning the deal was not going to happen. The New Mexico District Attorney will announce today whether the actor, Alec Baldwin, or others will face criminal charges over the fatal shooting on the set of the movie Rust in 2021. Cinematographer Helena Hutchins was killed when a gun Baldwin was using during a rehearsal fired a live bullet. Here's Martha with more.
This represents a judgment day, certainly in terms of any potential criminal reckoning for Alec Baldwin and others in connection with that shooting on the set of the film Rust. I'm sure you'll remember Helena Hutchins was a talented rising cinematographer, also the mother to a young son. She was shot dead accidentally by Alec Baldwin, a bullet that he shot travelling through her chest and lodging in the shoulder of the film's director, Joel Souza, who's made a full recovery. The Santa Fe District Attorney's Office has compiled a report stretching to hundreds of pages about that day and that incident. That office has now decided which individuals, if any, will be charged with criminal offences in regards to Ms Hutchins' death. Now, there are a number of individuals who may be found criminally culpable, potentially. One of those is, of course, Alec Baldwin. He admits pulling back the hammer, so the back part of the gun, but he denies pulling the trigger. He also denies having any knowledge of live rounds, live bullets on that set. But he also was one of the film's producers, so he very well could face criminal charges, and certainly some legal experts expect that he will. Another of those that may be considered for criminal charges is the film's assistant director, Dave Halls. He was inside that set when Helena Hutchins was shot dead, and he's alleged to have been the individual who handed the gun to Alec Baldwin. Another person who may be charged is the film's armourer, Hannah Gutierrez-Reed. In her role, she was responsible for all weapons on the set. She was relatively young at the time, only 24, which some people find remarkable given what huge responsibility that role is on a film set. So those are just three individuals who could face charges. Of course, there are other members of the production staff and cast and crew that also could face charges. We'll find out via a written statement from the Santa Fe District Attorney's Office around 4 p.m. today, UK time.
Sky News has travelled to Taiwan's most southern point to get a unique insight into a potentially perilous standoff playing out between China and the island nation. We met with former Navy radar operator and radio enthusiast Robin Su, who used equipment to allow us to listen in to fighter jet activity. Let's take a listen. Helen Ann, who filmed that for us, joining us now from Taiwan. Hello to you, Helen Ann. That's beautifully illustrating, if I might say so, just the sort of challenges that Taiwan is facing from the air.
That's exactly it. It gives us a really rare glimpse and an insight into this extremely serious standoff that goes on above the airs of Taiwan and the Taiwan Strait. And you wouldn't think it. This looks like a paradise here in the southern tip of Taiwan, absolutely beautiful part of the world. But there is a very serious standoff going on in the skies almost every single day now. Taiwan, of course, a self-governing island that China sees as its own. And Chinese fighter jets are now routinely, almost every single day, crossing what's called the median line, which is the unofficial maritime border between the two. And when that happens, the Taiwanese jets scramble to intercept them. And what we heard there in that clip was a live, real-time communication between those two militaries. The Taiwanese voice you heard there saying, "You're entering our airspace, essentially, leave immediately." We heard some other recordings as well, Kay, today that are really very unusual. We heard one from a PLA Air Force fighter, PLA, the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese army, essentially. And it's actually communicating with an American jet that we think flew over the south of Taiwan, probably from the Japanese direction. And that Chinese voice warning the American jet to stay away from its airspace, saying leave immediately, in English, actually, interestingly as well. So it is a rare glimpse into this standoff that's going on. And it matters because in my interview with Taiwan's foreign minister just yesterday, he said that the government really worry about these activities, because one misstep, one small mistake, one accident, and this could quite easily spiral and escalate into a very, very serious conflict. So a very interesting, little unusual look into just how tense it can be.
OK, for now, thanks so much indeed, Helen, and thank you. Manchester Airport has temporarily closed both of its runways due to heavy snowfall. The airport said health and safety will always be its top priority and that operations will resume at its earliest opportunity. Runways at the airport were also forced to close in December last year due to poor weather. A number of Met Office weather warnings are still in place across the UK as the cold weather continues. Let's bring in Joe with more. Good morning, Joe. We've seen what's been happening up in Manchester today. What about the rest of us?
Morning. Yeah, there are some wintry showers around bringing some snowfall. There's some wintry showers across Wales, northwest England. We've seen that heavy snow in Manchester and some across Northern Ireland and into northern parts of Scotland as well. And it's a freezing start. So as well as some snow in places, we're actually seeing icy stretches as well. So a freezing start across the country down to -8 degrees Celsius last night in Scotland, widely down to -1 and -2 degrees Celsius across the country. So freezing start, those icy stretches and a risk of some snowfall through the morning, and there will be further wintry showers as we go through the course of the morning and through the day. And there are Met Office warnings, like you said. We're seeing those warnings across northern and western parts of Scotland for snow and ice, also Northern Ireland, northwest England and Wales as well, with a snow and ice warning there valid until midday. There's also an ice warning across southwest England, which is valid until 10 o'clock this morning. But like I say, there will be further wintry showers around through the course of the day in the north and west, but elsewhere plenty of sunshine and mostly dry.
Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to The Breakfast Show here on Sky News. The Levelling Up Secretary, Michael Gove, has told this programme the government has to balance rewarding hard work while being careful with public money. He said everyone on the front line of the NHS is doing a fantastic job, but that the government can't meet every pay request.
I think we appreciate that nurses, everyone who's working on the front line in the National Health Service, is not only doing an amazing job, and my thanks and gratitude to nurses today is something I want to express very deeply and personally. I also think that when we're looking at the pay claims that are being made by people within the National Health Service and also people in other parts of the public sector, we have to balance making sure that we do everything we can to reward them for their hard work with recognising that we also have to be careful stewards of public money overall. And what we can't do is necessarily accede to every demand in the public sector for pay increases, because we don't want to be in a position where the public finances overall are out of control.
Yeah, so your colleagues are wrong to criticise the way nurses manage their money?
I would never criticise nurses for something like that. I think the most important thing to do is to recognise that people who are working in the NHS are people who've dedicated their lives to a caring profession. They're doing everything they can to support us.
Tamara's with us this morning. You wanted to talk about levelling up, which we went on to talk about, of course, but interesting comments about strikes.
Yes, and we've got a real spring of strikes now. We've got not only the nurses on strike again today, but in February we've got what's being described as the biggest walkout in the history of the NHS, where you've got nurses on strike, but also ambulance workers, both the paramedics and the call handlers on strike on the same day. And if you think about the fact that when there were nurses going on strike in December, around 30,000 elective procedures a day were cancelled. If you've got ambulance call handlers on strike as well, you're looking at some really serious disruption at hospitals, and of course the prospect of patients dying while they're waiting for an ambulance, as Keir Starmer raised Prime Minister's questions yesterday. The politics of this seems to be that Steve Barclay made quite a strong argument that the nurses should be given perhaps a one-off payment, perhaps their pay for next year brought forward. He lost that argument. Jeremy Hunt is being very, very tough on pay because the government fear that if you give one bit of the public sector a pay increase, then there will be a clamour to give the teachers a pay increase as well, for example. But the difficulty is that while Steve Barclay is now urging the nurses, please think about next year's pay settlement, I'm open to discussing that one. They want to go on strike now over this year's pay settlement. So when ministers are out trying to talk about other bits of policy, the question they're going to get is all the public can see are people going on strike in vital services.
He was very reluctant to criticise nurses' budgeting, though, wasn't he? We've seen in some of the papers this morning the former Levelling Up Secretary, Simon Clarke, saying that if nurses earn £37,000 and need a food bank, they're not budgeting properly.
Exactly, and Gillian Keegan, of course, on our programme, saying that people go to food banks for all sorts of personal reasons, like relationship breakdown. I think they are acutely aware at the top of government that the polling shows the public are on the side of nurses going on strike, and understand that someone earning even slightly above the average pay, 35 to 45,000 is the average pay for a nurse, will be struggling with living costs, with energy costs, with buying their children everything they need for school, as everyone else is. And I think Michael Gove is very aware of that.
OK, for now. Thanks. Tomorrow's take at 9 o'clock. Thank you. Now, a group of MPs and peers are calling on the government to appoint a mental health czar to be an advocate for patients. They also suggest a new commissioner could oversee reforms in the sector. It comes as the Joint Parliamentary Committee scrutinises the draft mental health bill. Joined now by the Joint Committee's chair, Baroness Boscombe. Hi, it's good to see you.
Hi, Kay. Thank you very much for having me on board.
Oh,
apologies for my voice.
Oh, dear, have you had one of those horrible colds that everybody's had? I hope you're recovering.
No, I'm fine, thank you.
Talk to us about the draft bill.
OK, so we really welcome, we being this joint committee, members of the Lords and the Commons and cross-party, so it's very much a collegiate approach to this. We really support the government's draft bill, which is all about improving patient choice, bringing down the number of people who are detained, and also making sure that we tackle real racial inequality that currently exists in the mental health system. But what we want to do as a committee, and we have now published a report recommending strengthening some of the proposals in the draft bill, because we believe in order for the government to achieve its aims, which are really good aims, and they're backed by so many people we listen to through taking evidence from patients, through carers, from families, is that the whole system needs to be better resourced. It needs to be, therefore, carefully implemented in terms of the timing of when parts of the bill become a reality, because we can't have people falling through the stalls and so on. And everyone seems to accept that. Let's get it absolutely right. But the person we think that could do that would be a mental health commissioner, someone who would be able to have oversight across the country, because provision is disparate across the country, to ensure that before people are released into the community, which we really want less restriction and more patient choice, that there are proper places in the community, safe places, where people can go when they're in a crisis and where they can be supported, properly supported. So it's a big move, it's a big challenge, but we believe it's the right way forward.
You talked there about racial disparity, Baroness. What about those with autism and learning difficulties? Are they looked after well enough?
Well, the difficulty is that too many of them are being detained in totally inappropriate settings. And this has been going on for far too long. It has to stop. People with learning difficulties and autism may need to be detained for short periods of time in order to assess what the problem really is. But we are saying no longer than 28 days, except in exceptional circumstances. Because the reality is, these people can be perfectly well looked after when they know there's somewhere that they can go to in the community where they can have a safe space in order to cope with their crisis, and proper support as well, proper advocacy, people who actually can say to them, you know, how can we help you have a stronger voice, treat you as an individual, because we want fewer restrictions upon these people. And we want them to be treated as individuals and respected with dignity.
We must leave it there, Baroness. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
One aspect, as we were hearing, that the committee considered, bear with me 1 second, is the draft bill's ability to tackle racial disparity and how it interacted with the criminal justice system. Joined now by Chief Officer of the Caribbean and African Health Network, Charles Kwaku-Odoe. Hi, Charles. Good to see you. What difference will this mental health bill make for the people that you represent?
Good to see you, Kay. I think first and foremost, we need to welcome the bill and the recognition of the racial disparities that we've known about for a few decades now. And what, picking on the Baroness's point, we're delighted this is cross-party, because what we need is that long-term commitment, because short-term stuff wouldn't work. And I think we've seen the data, and we can talk about the data all day, but for Black people, more likely to be detained, poorer outcomes when you look at perinatal mental health, when you look at, the outcomes within acute settings. So it's quite complex. And I think what we need is that commitment beyond the bill, but then for senior health leaders and service providers and commissioners to put the resource where it is needed. One size wouldn't fit all.
OK, are you hopeful, though? I mean, hearing what we've just been hearing from the Baroness and the information that you've received so far, are you hopeful that this report and the subsequent legislation will tackle racial disparity issues that obviously you and those that you represent are very concerned about, particularly when it comes to mental health treatment?
Yes, we're hopeful, because if you look at what is happening since the pandemic, there has been a real recognition of how health inequalities are quite deep in when it comes to marginalized, underserved communities. And one of the priorities for every ICS, the 42 across, England and Wales, is to tackle health inequalities. So what we're saying is, we need to use those multi-pronged approach and the levers that have been provided, followed by the resources and the, argument for long-term investment into this to bring about the change. And I think the other point worth mentioning, which the Baroness referred to, is about community care, because sometimes there's a real divide between acute care and what is happening in the community, and which brings into focus the role of voluntary sector organizations in tackling the issues and moving away from the medicalized model. That is where, if we can work right across sectors, making sure that we're resourcing the work of voluntary sector organizations to, work in conjunction with acute statutory bodies, then that is when we're going to see a long-term change.
OK, it's good to talk to you. Thanks for explaining that to us and for joining us so early in the morning. Thank you. Hello again, everybody. Welcome back to The Breakfast Show on Sky News. The government has insisted any change to NHS pay has to be decided by the Independent Pay Review Body. But the British Medical Association, or BMA, has today published a report describing the independence of the body as a sham. The chair of the BMA's Consultants Committee, Dr Vishal Sharma, is with us now. Hello to you, Doctor. Thanks so much indeed for joining us on the programme this morning. You've talked about a litany of instances of meddling and interference as far as the government is concerned. You also talk about wholesale reform of the review body covering the pay of doctors as well as dentists as not being resolved. And you go on to talk about the pay review body being a sham. Tell us more.
Yeah, so the pay review bodies were set up because obviously in the NHS we have essentially a monopoly employer. So if you aren't happy with your pay, you can't go around and look for a different employer because the terms and conditions are all the same. But for over 10 years, the government have really constrained the pay review body. So for example, between 2010 and 2017, they essentially told the pay review body that even though inflation was running higher, that they had to either freeze pay or cap pay rises to 1%. So they had no power to actually do anything about it. And the pay review body that's supposedly independent just went along with that. And in 2018, as another example, that's when the pay review body thought, actually, this is not right. We will actually recommend a higher award than the government's limit of 1%. And they recommended 2%. But the government decided that they weren't going to have that. And they actually essentially reduced it by half by only paying it for half the year. So when the government's interfering with the process like that, it can't be independent because it's really capping the amount of recommendations it can make.
Yeah, I put that actually to Robert Jenrick yesterday. He insisted that the pay review body is independent. He says, of course, they have to work within a budget, and of course, the Prime Minister and the ministers involved will know what that budget cap must be.
Yeah, but the budget is an arbitrary limit set by government. It's not really a real budget, if that makes sense. So the government, for example, are telling the pay review body that the budget is set for the next few years at, for example, 2% for next year, and they're also saying that they need to keep in line with the inflation target, not the actual level of inflation, but the inflation target. And again, that inflation target is 2%. But we all know that inflation's out of control and it's running at 10%. So having these arbitrary limits, because they are choices by government, it really means that the pay review bodies can't do their job and be independent. And when they were first set up, so they were first set up following a royal commission in the 1960s, they were really interested in only three things: making sure that the pay kept up with the cost of living, to make sure that actually it kept up with other comparative professions, and that actually recruitment and retention in the medical and dental workforce was on track. And all three of those things it's failed with.
But the funds aren't endless, is what the government would say. The Treasury will say, potentially, to the NHS, this is how much money you can have this year. And then that information distills down to the pay review body.
But again, these are choices. So the government since 2008 has essentially not been funding the NHS properly, and that's why we're in the mess that we're in. And that increases cost. When it wants to find money, it's very able to find money. It found huge sums of money for things like test and trace, which were a failure at £37 billion. It also finds money when it wants to in other areas. Only in the last mini budget, for example, it's lifted caps on bankers' bonuses. There are other things that it chooses to do, but it's choosing to sort of restrict doctors' and dentists' pay.
But junior doctors and consultants, I believe, have pulled out of the pay review process for this year. How does that help?
So we've had long-standing concerns about the pay review process, and actually juniors and doctors in England withdrew last year. So this isn't a new thing. But what's interesting is a lot of other unions have actually come to the same conclusion, that actually participating in this is not a helpful process. I think the reason we've withdrawn from this is two reasons. First of all, we're demanding that the process is reformed. So we've written very clearly to the Secretary of State and to the chair of the DDRB, who's our pay review body, to say this cannot go on. It needs to be reformed alongside its founding principles. But also, it's to not be part of this sham process, because obviously the government have really taken to the pay review bodies this year, sort of saying they're bound by them and that they're independent and they can't do anything differently. And we know that's not true. And I think by participating in that, we're sort of essentially giving the government a bit more of a line to actually say that's the process being used, but we just don't have confidence in it anymore, and that's why we've pulled out.
You talk about a litany of instances of meddling and interference by the government. Do you have examples?
Yeah, so along with those examples that I mentioned, where essentially the government's told the pay review body what the maximum it can give, being 0 to 1% for about 8 years. Only last year and the year before, for example, the junior doctors, they agreed a new contract a few years ago. And as part of that contract, there was a funding envelope that was kind of agreed for the sort of contract change. But in that contract, it was very, very clear that if there are exceptional circumstances, that the DDRB can actually make higher pay uplifts during that period. And there's nothing more exceptional really than the global pandemic and the highest inflation for 40 years. And yet the government essentially told the DDRB that they could not make a recommendation for junior doctors' pay. And if you read the last report, it was clear that the DDRB wanted to make a recommendation, for junior doctors' pay that was higher than their multi-year deal. But they essentially said, we'd like to give a recommendation, but we're prevented from doing so by government. And again, that's essentially in the report from last year. So again, it's another example where they're just essentially doing what they're told.
Again, looking at the report, suggesting that it's becoming more attractive for GPs to work in another country.
It's not just GPs, it's true of junior doctors, it's true of consultants, and it's true of GPs. Again, because there's very little opportunity to work within medicine outside the NHS, because obviously it's the monopoly employer, essentially, people are looking at elsewhere. And we are we are constantly seeing recruitment companies from overseas trying to take our doctors to other countries where they actually do pay much, much better. It's very possible to get pay that's 2 or 3 times higher in Australia, America, Canada, etc. And people are going, and it's a real, real problem for us.
OK, thanks very much indeed. Thank you. Well, can the NHS survive? We'll be asking that question during a debate on the future of our health service next Thursday, the 26th of January. Scan the QR code on screen or email nhscrisis@sky.uk if you'd like to be in the live audience at University Hospital Coventry. That's a special debate on the future of the NHS next Thursday, 7 o'clock, here on Sky News.